Well, it's really good to have you with us tonight, Yvonne. Thank you for joining us. I know you've got a very interesting story to tell, but I just want to find out a little bit about you personally first. Um, you were the PA to quite some leading business characters, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, my working career, I tended to work at boardroom and director level. So I worked in some very interesting organisations for some very influential people. And I enjoyed that greatly. I was very good at what I did. And I worked, I mean, I worked for legal firms. I worked in finance. I worked for the lottery, which was probably one of the most interesting jobs I did, and I loved that job because I was so ego driven, and I was called the private office manager to the chair. So I managed him and his office in terms of the logistics of how he operated, and he was a charming man. And yeah, I had great fun doing what I did. I enjoyed my working career very, very much.
And were you regularly being told, tell them I'm not in?
Oh, in the early days, work culture changed somewhat, and but I never had any problem with that. I was a proficient teller of what do we call it, economical with the truth. I think it was Margaret Thatcher's
Yes.
government's famous words at the Falklands. I was very, very good at being economical with the truth, and in those days, being dishonest or just not telling the truth came very easily. So yeah, I mean, in my early part of my career, it was that they were the days of the long lunches. And of course, with technology being what it was then, people were much harder to keep track of. So, it was very easy to just disappear off the scene for an afternoon and not be found.
Interesting. And where did you grow up? What was your home life like as a child and a teenager?
Yeah, I grew up in North London. I was born in Holloway, and my parents are always really keen to make sure that people realise I wasn't born in the prison, because I think
Yes.
that's what often springs to mind. I'm an avid Arsenal supporter. We've got an Arsenal Tottenham divide in our family, but I'm a Gooner, and yeah, I had a charmed childhood, really. Very ordinary working class family, very well cared for, very loved. If I could accuse my parents of anything, I may have been spoiled slightly. My mum and dad were really hardworking and very aspirational for myself and my brother. They had a great desire for us to have a really good education, and they both worked really hard to pay for a private education for us, which we both had, and which I will say my brother made the absolute best use of and is now very successful in his field, and which I didn't make as good use of as I could have.
All right, well, we'll come
But
on to that, but you've made no mention at all of church or prayers or anything. Was it not a Christian family at all?
yeah, it was. It was a nominal Roman Catholic, a sort of Irish Roman Catholic. My mum was, my mum was the driving force in my family. My mum was very, very very driven for us, and driven for ambitious and keen to see us succeed. So my schooling was in convent settings, so I was educated by nuns, and we went to church every Sunday, and I made my first confession at the age of 6, which is actually quite young, but I was tall, so I was deemed big enough to go and
Big
do my
enough a
first
sinner to
confession.
make confession.
Yeah, yeah. So that was at 6, and then I made my Holy Communion, and I was confirmed. And really, because of my parents' sacrifices in those early days, I had a scholarship for secondary school, and had a private education, which my parents no longer had to pay for, um, which was also convent school.
But you've given the impression already, Yvonne, that something began to go astray in those
Mm.
teenage years. What was happening? What was going on?
Yeah, I mean, it probably started to go astray before then. As a very, very young child, I remember just believing everything that I was taught. I had great respect for authority, for adults, for teachers, and I believe we were. The Bible was obviously part of my education with nuns, and there was, you know, a very strong religious aspect. But, you know, going back to that very first confession, I remember climbing into that confessional box full of fear and terror, because I really didn't know what was expected. But what I'd been told is I had to have 3 sins to confess. And I can honestly remember just making up 3 stories that were not true. And when I came out, because of what I've been taught, I thought, that's me. I'm toast. I'm gone. You know, by the time I get up to the altar rail to say these 2 Hail Marys and 1 Our Father that were given as my penance, I'm going to be, you know, lightning will strike me and I will be gone. And that didn't happen. And I remember leaving that church thinking, aha, what I've believed in can't be true, because what I've been taught hadn't happened. And that little seed was planted at a very young age, that the God that I'd been taught was definitely there, had made me, lots of early learning, had just been dissolved. You know, it had been started to be dissolved, that belief that I had. And as I went through my, you know, latter years at primary school and my early teens, that sense of disbelief actually hardened into real atheism. And that was, you know, for me, that was fantastic, because what that meant, there was no moral code, no values, there was nothing was off limits. And I was the teenager from hell. My poor family did not know what had hit them. You know, I reached that age where young people begin to make their own decisions because they're in a position to do so. Mine were dreadful, but I didn't think they were. I so thought I'd pressed this big button marked freedom, and I did what I wanted. I went where I wanted. I mixed with who I wanted, and started to experiment in lots of areas where, you know, nobody really should go at all. And I was very young. I was only 15 at this stage.
And was nobody trying to restrain you at all, either at school or at home, or?
At school, I was very good at just sinking into the background, although I did spend quite a lot of time with the headmistress, and I don't think that was because she longed for my company. I was I was what I'd call a low-level disruptor. I wasn't vile or violent, but I was yeah, I wouldn't have wanted me in a classroom if I was a teacher. I was a nuisance. I was a nuisance more than that. But at home, I was awful. I was disobedient. You know, and as I said, my family weren't, you know, a lovely lady once said to me, the only reason you have a right to call your family dysfunctional, Yvonne, is because you're a member of it. The rest of them are so functioning and just very like normal people, just getting on with their everyday lives. And they, you know, this awful teenager rebel was pushing every boundary. You know, I'd be told to be home at a certain time. I was given lifts, and I had some nice friends, given lifts to friends' houses, but I'd just disappear. I'd just go off radar, and it never gave a thought to, you know, I'd come home and it would be ridiculously late and the door was locked, so I'd have to bang on the door, and then there'd be a massive argument, and it was all, my parents were unreasonable. They were trying to deny my freedom, my rights to live my life as I would so choose it. I was meeting boyfriends, and they weren't the sort of boyfriends. I think the you know, finally one came home, and this is no comment on anything. You know, my son has a tattoo in his arm, but I brought this really tattooed boy home, and my mum was just like, that's it, please don't bring anybody home anymore. She'd had enough. Her patience had worn out, and by 17 it had worn out fully, and I left the family home.
And your parents must have been heartbroken.
Yeah, oh, they were. They didn't know, and of course, my brother was only a couple of years younger, and he was, you know, he's a lovely young man. He was doing all the things. He was studying hard, working hard at school, you know, and they just kind of, I think they were baffled as to where they'd got me from. They didn't know how to handle me, and that's no reflection on them. I was like a, you know, yeah, crazy.
So boys, but drink as well, drugs or what?
Oh, absolutely. I picked my first drink up at 15, not having come from an alcoholic home. You know, in my home, there'd be one bottle of Harvey's Bristol Cream that would sit on the sideboard or the drinks cabinet, and it would still be there next Christmas gathering dust. It was mainly used to pop in a bit of trifle or something. There was no real drinking and certainly no drunkenness in my childhood. But I took my first drink at 15 and I was off and running. It was like the greatest love affair of my life really at that point was with alcohol. And I loved it. I thought it represented freedom. It made me feel omnipotent. It made me feel godlike. The more I drank, the more I wanted. Right from the beginning, I was never a temperate or moderate drinker. Once I started, I just, as I called it then, I got the flavour. And I was like that right from the start. I loved it. I had a passion for it.
Amazing. And so what work did you get at 17?
At 17, I left home and I was just finishing college. I had managed to get to college, and I actually got my very first job was in an advertising agency next door to Saatchi & Saatchi in Charlotte Street. And that was my very, very first job. And I was very well paid. I kind of fell into a good job. And from that point, I really started to develop what I'd call a double life. So I had the exterior and the ability to manage a professional work life. And I was actually professional in my job, but I began that habit. And in the early days, it was just weekends. Every weekend became a lost weekend. I drank uncontrollably all weekend, every weekend. And I was just out. I was, as soon as Friday came around, that was it. Friday night, Saturday lunchtime, Saturday night. And of course, it was more difficult in those days because we had such a thing as opening and closing hours, which don't really exist now. And, you had to be really canny to get enough in during the times you were allowed to be there, unless you were so fortunate, which I was very good at making friends, not keeping them. I would often have that, the absolute epitome of success for anyone who drinks like me is a lock-in a pub where they lock the doors after closing time and they let you stay behind. And that was my idea. But I would get up Monday, go to work, deliver the goods, and continued like that for quite some time.
The trouble is with earning money, of course, then you've got all these things accessible. They're available for you, aren't they? Yeah,
lots of disposable income. So I didn't deny myself anything. I wasn't a saver, I was a spender. So I spent my money on alcohol, on clothes, and in my late teens, drugs came into the scene as well, and I started to use cocaine. And that became a big part because, chemically, the thing with that is it gave me an ability to drink even more and even longer. I honestly thought I was on this massive success kind of elevator going. So I don't know where I was. If someone had said to me, "Where are you going?" I wouldn't have known, but I thought I'm really enjoying the ride. It's great fun. I looked at the people, the normal friends I'd had at school, and I'd had lots of them who by 20, 21, 22 were engaged. They were in solid relationships. They were getting married. They were starting to settle down and have a family. And I was like, that really is very sad. I feel so sorry for you. Why would you want to be doing that when you could be doing what I'm doing?
And no thought of God at all?
No, oh my gosh, no. And anybody came near me with anything God, I just had this violent internal reaction, absolute anger, antagonism. Keep away from me.
So, Yvonne, I know you got married. How did you meet him?
I wonder where I might have met my husband. I met him in a bar. That would come as a real surprise, won't it? So I met my lovely husband in a bar, and by that stage, I'd gone on into my late 20s, doing very much what I've just explained, and very Phoenix-like. There were times when there were consequences to my behaviour, but I had an ability to resurrect myself from the ashes of the past, move on, and create a new life for myself. I'd got engaged many times in my 20s. I was a professional fiance. I loved being engaged, with no intention of actually marrying at that point. But
have you kept all the engagement rings?
Oh, do you know what? couple of them, but they were the cheaper ones. The one who wanted the ring back was the only one who really bought me an expensive ring, and he wanted that ring back, and I did actually give it back to him, and yeah, they had a lucky escape, and I mean that genuinely, these poor guys. But you know, I met this amazing man. His name was Paul, and I met him, and he wasn't like the people I had begun to kind of gravitate towards. He was honest, he was decent, he was hardworking, he was affluent, he had his own business, you know, and that sort of stuff really mattered to me. And he was a really decent guy. He was, and when I say he was honest, I mean he was really honest. He paid his bills, his taxes. He wasn't the sort of person that I'd normally be attracted to, actually, but I think his honesty and his decency attracted me as being solid. And by this time I was, you know, in my late 20s, and I was kind of getting tired of keep on doing what I'd been doing. And I saw Paul as an anchor and a reliable, and I fell in love. It wasn't a sort of just a logical kind of decision. I fell in love with him, and I you know, yeah, we got engaged, and it was, you know, we kind of did things. We got engaged, and we had an engagement, and then in a couple of years we got married, and I got married at the age of 30 to this lovely man. And I drank. Paul liked to drink, but he was not a drinker like me. He was a take it or leave it, and I was so in love. My drinking actually abated somewhat. It didn't stop, but it was moderated, just, you know, by being in love and being with somebody who didn't drink the way I would have drunk. If he'd have drunk like me, I would have done the same.
Would you have, do you think it's fair to call you an alcoholic?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. But if you'd have called me that at 29 or 30, I would have been mortally wounded. And you would not have seen, you would have seen a very well presented, very well dressed, very, you know, I don't mean very made up, but, you know, I looked together. The outside looked good for such a long time. I'm amazed. I don't know how it did, but the outside looked successful, for want of a word.
But all these things have consequences, don't they? And things did begin to spiral down.
Absolutely. You know, we got married, and we bought a beautiful home. We moved to the suburbs, and I had 2 children. And it's really hard, because I think what happened was I carried on working. I'd worked for throughout all of this time. And what happened for me when we had our first son together, we were in a position where I didn't need to work. It wasn't necessary financially, and I really wanted to have a beautiful home, and it was kind of, you know, ticking all those boxes. And I stopped work. Now, stopping work didn't make me an alcoholic, but what it took the scaffolding away from my daily life. It took the support and the discipline and the routine and the structure away from getting up on Monday, going to work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That was gone, and I was at home on my own with this adorable baby who I loved, and I started to drink on my own, and it became earlier and earlier and earlier. And I was, my poor husband was coming home, and he was saying, "You're drunk," and I was saying, you know, the consummate liar, standing nose to nose with him, smelling of Fisherman's Friend and Gold Spot breath mints and whatever, saying, "No, I'm not, I'm just tired, I've got a baby, I don't know," you know, just coming out. And I was drunk. I was hiding drinking on my own. And I decided something wasn't quite right, so I just had another baby. I thought maybe I've got too much time on my hands, so we had another baby, and it just got worse and worse and worse, and my home became a war zone. My poor husband didn't know what to do. He had his own business, he had many demands on his time, and he had a drunken wife at home with two babies under 2 years of age who he was, and the family all got involved. My mother got involved, his mother got involved, and the friction and the chaos it caused between everybody. I was oblivious to all this. I just was getting drink. You know, he took my credit cards away, my car keys away. I wasn't, he wouldn't give me access to money, but I'm very resourceful. I would find money. And I would go and find drink, and I would go and visit people who I knew had drink in their house, and when they went to answer the phone, I'd be in their drink cabinet just necking their drink out of the bottle. I was desperate, really, just to drink. Wow. That was all I wanted.
Now, clearly the family were aware and trying to help. Were you sufficiently aware that you began to seek any help from anybody else outside of the immediate family?
I did, but I have to say, if I'm really honest, that wasn't so much because I wanted to seek the help. That was because they wanted me to seek it. So my dear husband, he used every, financial resource he had. I had talking therapy. I had, medical intervention through the doctor. I had relapse prevention therapy, which, he paid for all this, to sit and talk to someone about my feelings. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it didn't really do me any good because A, I was very dishonest anyway, and B, I didn't want to stop drinking. I just wanted people, I can remember thinking to myself, if everyone just left me alone, I'd be fine. And people weren't leaving me alone. People were really all over me like a rash and really giving me an awful lot of trouble and grief. The selfishness and self-centeredness it beggars belief, actually, when I look back at it now. Yeah.
And were drugs involved at this stage as well, or not?
Yes, they were, and that part of it, my husband had no idea. My husband was a keep fit fanatic. He never ever even put a cigarette to his lips ever. He'd never smoked a cigarette. He liked a glass of wine or a pint of beer when he played his sport after football or squash, but he had no idea that was so secret from everybody. I managed to hide that really, really, really well, because I think if he'd have known, if that had been an area that he'd had some experience in, the signs were there, but he just didn't know. The drinking was very obvious. The drugs were less so, but they were very much hand in hand.
But Yvonne, eventually you go back to work, and how do you cover up this lifestyle while you're working in these high-profile jobs?
Well, it's very easy actually to present well. I'm a very resourceful person, and wherever I choose to channel my resources, I'm pretty good at getting what I want. And someone said to me, in later years when I finally began to be honest, the shop window looks nice, but what's going on in the stock room? And it was my problem always was with my internal condition. My problem wasn't my circumstances. I had, I say this, and I had a loving husband, beautiful children, a lovely home, couple of cars, foreign holidays, money in the bank, food in the fridge, clothes in the wardrobe, tick, 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 successful. But there was something very, very wrong with me. And that internal dissatisfied spirit that I now know. But yeah, and drink and drugs temporarily gave me a sense of ease and comfort of being in the world. And of course, it's not sustainable.
Well, Yvonne, you've been really honest. You've described your life as it was, but we know, and that's why you're here, something radically changed. It changed you, or rather he changed you. Tell us what led to your Christian conversion.
Well, towards the end of, my desperate drinking, my husband sent me to Alcoholics Anonymous, which I was really cross about because, look at me, I was arriving in this really lovely Jaguar car to this meeting, and I remember looking around and thinking, well, I'm not like these people, the arrogance and the pride and the ego, just looking at the shop window. So I arrived at this meeting. The people were really kind. I had lots of similarities, and they talked about their drinking, but I didn't really relate to them. And I did manage, just by going to AA meetings, I actually stopped drinking for a short period of time. I didn't do anything they suggested. They mentioned God, they mentioned a spiritual program, and I was like, that's an optional extra for people who are just real losers. It's not for people like me, the successful winners of life. And so I got, my husband was delighted. I was not drinking, and that hadn't happened for a long time. And I went on holiday, paid for me to have a lovely holiday as a kind of reward, and I had a sober holiday, came home, and then one evening I drank again, and my goodness, I'd had about 10 weeks of not drinking, and I drank again, and the minute I drank that drink again, I was not only back to where I'd been 10 weeks before. I was in a dreadful state. My mind, everything. I was a wreck. I was an absolute wreck, and as a result of that, my mental health deteriorated really quickly. And I'd never been, the blessing. I'd never suffered from depression. I was always the optimist, but even optimists need to be optimists in reality. I was an optimist despite reality, really. But my mental health deteriorated, and I actually ended up making a very serious attempt on my life, and I was taken to through my husband's health insurance. I was put into what I like to call a treatment centre, but really it was a very posh, paid for psychiatric hospital, and I ended up there in August 1995. Over the whole month of August, I was there.
So go on, you enter this smart place. And Yvonne, are you in a single room, or are you in a ward?
I mean, it was beautiful. You had a chef, and you picked your food, and the grounds were amazing. You could walk in the grounds. You weren't allowed out off of the facilities, but there was plenty there to keep you engaged. But I was there, and I I was separated from my family. I was told I was going to be there for a while. And I just, it gave me some time. It was another period of just no alcohol and no drugs. There was nothing in my.
Were you actually sectioned then?
Do you know what? I wasn't sectioned because I didn't fight it. If I'd have fought it, I would have been. But I remember when I was admitted to hospital, when I'd taken the overdose, they just told me, this is where you need to go. You need to go, and purely because of my husband's money, he was able to pay for private rather than I would have gone either to an NHS facility or a private facility. But that's how I ended up.
He was incredibly patient with you, wasn't he?
Oh my goodness, beyond measure. I mean, I often say to people, if the roles had been reversed, I would have opened the door and I would have put him out, and I would have said, goodbye, you need to go. And I don't know how, I still to this day don't know how. Love is an amazingly powerful tool. And yeah, I'm so grateful to God today for him.
So Yvonne, you find yourself in this rehabilitation centre. Tell us what happened.
Well, I was there, and it was very peaceful, and it gave me time to think. It gave me time to think as clearly as I could, which sounds very bizarre for someone who's in a psychiatric facility. And I started to remember, the people in AA had talked about God and how God had helped them, but I didn't really know what that meant. I was confused, and I'd actually lived next door to a lovely pastor, and he'd used to come into my house and have conversations with me and talk about God, and I just used to think, I wish he'd hurry up and go, because I need to get that bottle that's hidden under the kitchen sink or whatever it was. These thoughts started to come back to me, and I remember I was out walking one day in the grounds, and it was beautiful, and I was just looking at stuff that I hadn't seen forever, really, just the beauty of, as I understand it, creation. And I looked around, and I went back to my room, and I thought, I'll just read something. And I remember, because I'd kind of been packed off so quickly, I hadn't had time to pack books, and I wasn't really a great reader anyway. And I opened the drawer of my bedside cabinet in this very nice hospital, thinking there's bound to be a Vogue or a Cosmopolitan or some wonderful glossy magazine that I can kind of, look for a nice outfit, because Paul's going to be so pleased he'll buy me new clothes when I come home. I'm a deep, meaningful person at this point. And there was a Bible. That was all that was in the drawer, was a Bible. And I remember I opened it, and I'd seen a Bible. I knew that, I didn't know a great deal. I knew there was an Old Testament and a New Testament, and there were 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I flicked through the Bible, and I just alighted on a story in Luke chapter 7, in the Gospel of Luke. And I began to read the story. And the story, I've got my Bible here, the story is called A Sinful Woman Forgiven. And I don't think I read that bit, that's just obviously the title, but I read this story, and there was this woman, and she was in a town, and she heard this man called Jesus was in town. And it said, it's very, it said, behold, a woman of the city. And I don't think that means that she was a city worker. I think that may allude to something else about this lady, but there we go. And it said, behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner. When she learned that Jesus was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, bought an alabaster flask of ointment. But what struck me, and it was honestly, it was like this woman who was a sinner, and it was like a doctor giving me my diagnosis, because I'd had so many people try to help me find what was wrong with me. And it was like, you know, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The needle wasn't even there, because what we were looking at was all my symptoms, and I didn't have anything that matched up to justify why I was doing what I was doing to myself. And when I saw that there was a woman who was a sinner, it was almost as if the breath left my body. I was that. It was like, oh, that's what's wrong with me. That's what's wrong with me. And yet the day before, if you'd have come to visit me and said, Yvonne, you're a sinner, I would have wanted to take your head off of its shoulders. I would have been so cross. How dare you say that about me? And I just knew I was that moment of, you know, as I understand it, yes, it's God's spirit and it's God's word, and it's just that complete deflation of the ego and the will and the you know, my belief in myself. It was because I'd always had self-belief. I didn't know you, that may surprise you having listened to me. I was always, I can do this, yes I can, you know, like yes we can, and I couldn't. And in that moment I saw why, because I am a sinner. Yeah, and you know, and I read through the rest of the story. I mean, by this time I was literally on my knees by the side of my bed with tears, and I was really good at crying, because great actress. I cried so many times, and my poor husband, being such a sweet man, would let me off of stuff, and I could just turn the tears on with a tap. And I cried, and these were heartfelt tears, and I wasn't crying for myself. I was 35, and it was like I'd got a flashback of all my life, and I just thought, you know, it's very simple and childlike, but God's given me life, God's made me, and he loves me. And what have I done for 35 years? I've shook my fist, I've turned my back, and I've just walked away, run away, you know, and just not even looked back. And I kind of, it sounds very, well, it was very profound, and it was just all that was coming at me at once. And you know, along with that, reading the story, if I left it there, that would be really sad, because that's where I'd still be. You know, God is amazing in his forgiveness. You know, I recognized my condition. I recognized Jesus for who he is, the Son of God. I recognized his ability to forgive. And I just read through that story, and you know, it talks about two debtors. One doesn't owe much, one owes an awful lot, and I am the debtor who owes an amount I cannot pay. I cannot pay back what I did, but there is one who has done that for me, done it on my behalf, and forgiven me for it all as well.
So that very day, you put your trust in Jesus Christ.
Absolutely.
And what was the, you know, outward impact of that? Okay, you were forgiven, but outwardly, how did it show?
Well, I mean, it was becoming late afternoon at that point, and I remember just staying in my room, and I just started reading the Bible. I was just like, I almost wanted to eat it. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but I was just reading it, and I was starting to remember. It's amazing, because nothing in God's economy is wasted. I was starting to remember all these little stories and parables and bits of the Bible that I'd heard when I was a child, when I was at school, when the nuns had taught me, and it was all coming back to me, and even the kind of set prayers I'd learned as a young person. And I was just absolutely overwhelmed, really, with the sense of the presence of God. And I remember thinking, and I always say at this point, and I wasn't taking any substances. Often people in my condition are placed on a medical regime. I was completely free of everything, and I had been so for about 10 days. I wasn't taking any prescribed or illicit drugs. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, it's coming to night time. I need to go to sleep, but what if I wake up in the morning and it's gone? What if what's happened isn't there in the morning? And oh goodness, I slept as I've never slept before. And when I woke up in the morning, God was with me, and he's never left me since. I'm so sorry. It was 25 years ago, but it still overwhelms me, the grace of God.
Amen. That's wonderful. And drink and drugs and
absolutely just removed, completely
you've
removed.
Never had the desire to go back at all?
Never. And I'm so, you know, that's not everyone's story. I've met many people over many years who still, you know, will struggle or struggle for a while and then don't. But it was just in terms of alcohol, drugs, and any illicit substances, it was just taken away. I've never ever even had the inkling of a thought to have a drink or to take a drug. You know, I mean, if I've got a headache, I will take a paracetamol, but
yes, okay.
never. It was, you know, it was a complete healing miracle. What happened.
Amazing. So you went back to your husband and your family and a different woman. Did they appreciate that?
Yeah, well, I think they did, but it took, oh, goodness me, it took a lot of harm had been done over many years, Roger, and it took a lot of time because they'd had false storms before. You know, they'd had times when, oh, she hasn't had a drink, oh, she hasn't had a drink, or and then she drank again. And I think everybody walked on eggshells. You know, my lovely mum, oh my goodness, and remember this was before mobile phones were the big thing. My mum phoned me every single day for a whole year at around 11 o'clock in the morning, because my mum knew if I'd had one drink, she would phone me from North London. I'm in Southeast England, and she would phone and say, you've been drinking, and she just knew. And she was phoning me every day, and I had to learn really to be very patient with people. I knew I was well. I knew God had done something miraculous in my life, but other people needed to see the evidence and the proof of that. They didn't know what I knew. They hadn't experienced what I'd experienced. I joined a local church, which was amazing. I was baptized, which was...
This was by full immersion you were baptized?
Yes, it was. Yeah, which was incredible on bonfire night, which was great because there was all fireworks going off. I don't know if that meant something, but it was quite incredible. It was a bonfire night, and it was it was amazing, and just an amazing opportunity to give my testimony and to give so much thanks to my family. I couldn't thank them enough then, and I can't thank them enough now, as well as thanking my God.
Yes. Now, Yvonne, it's an amazing story, but of course it wasn't all straight sailing for you, was it? Tell us about what happened to your husband.
Well, you know, my husband, as I've said, was a lovely man, I remember coming home from hospital and thinking, I cannot wait just to tell them all about Jesus, and they're all going to come to believe in Jesus, and we're all going to just be this big kind of family of believers in Jesus. And my husband, he wasn't antagonistic. He wasn't how I had been. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't disinterested, but he was just apathetic. It was kind of, and it's very hard, you know, because he ticked lots of boxes of a good life. And he would come to church with me, to special events. My boys came to, we had something called Christian Endeavour in those days. I helped out with that, and they came to that, and they came to church on Sundays. But it became difficult as the children became older. You know, my husband was keen on sport, so the boys wanted to play football on Sundays. So it started to be, it was me going to church, and they were doing something else. And, you know, I had very godly leadership around how to be a godly wife in a non-Christian marriage. You know, and it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. But God had placed me there as a believer, and you know, I'd made that decision to marry my husband many years before I came to faith. And my lovely husband, you know, he was still carried on with his sport, and he left home to play squash one evening. And he had a massive heart attack on the squash court, and he died. And and you know, it's so painfully sad. He died instantly. There was nothing anybody could do. You know, there was a fireman on the next court. He gave all the treatment that could have helped him, and and at the hospital they said, even if what had happened to him, even if it had happened in a hospital facility, they couldn't have saved him. His heart attack was so massive that it was beyond any repair. So so that, you know, that was painful and sad. And you know, the children were still young. Boys were 11 and 13, but you know, God has saved me for a reason, and you know, I didn't fall apart. And, you know, I think people were looking and thinking, oh my goodness, is this going to be, you know, the trigger for, you know, me to maybe drink again or just go off the rails. And I didn't, you know, and God has kept me stable and steadfast and sure and certain, you know, on him as my rock. To be able to be there for my boys, to be, you know, and it would have been such a different story if that hadn't happened to me. So yeah, my heart is pained at the loss of my dear husband, and you know, I still thank God for him today.
Yvonne, it's lovely to listen to you, and it's a very well thought through story you tell, but the Lord Jesus Christ, he really means everything to you, doesn't he?
Absolutely, but you know, I always say never as much as he should. There's always more. A lovely lady always said to me, you know, it's not about how much God you think you've got, it's about how much of self and you're willing to abandon to him on a daily basis. And that's always my daily striving through the Christian life, is, you know, to be free from selfishness and self-centeredness. I had a lovely conversation with a lady the other day, and we were talking about the kind of trap of kindness, when you know, almost kindness can become a kind of replacement for real godliness. And it's a really hard one to pick apart, but you know, we can get into an ease of just being kind and gentle and thoughtful, but we soon can become shaken when perhaps the outcome isn't what we might have expected, or somebody really kind of gets in there. But you know, God grows us through all those experiences. And yeah, I love Jesus with my heart, soul, mind and body, but I can always love him a little bit more. But you know, he knows I'm human. I mean, I love, you know, the kind of, you know, I read about Peter and about Paul, and they, you know, they were human beings. We don't, you know, elevate them to positions above and beyond Jesus, because Christ is the only perfect man who ever lived, without fault, spotless, pure. And yeah, and he loves us, and he loves us as we are. That relationship can never be broken despite of myself, and the daily striving to grow in love and fellowship with Jesus, and as a family of believers, and yeah, and to make him known to other people, just to share the love that he has for us, and the love he has for those of us, all of us he's made in his image. We're all image bearers of Christ.
Yvonne, thank you so much.